Gabe Howard, and I am with NAMI Tennessee, and I am super excited to be here for another NAMI at Home Facebook Live. We do these every Monday. I mean, except for last Monday when Facebook shut down. I mean, what happened there? We did have to skip that one, but it wasn't our fault. It was the billion-dollar company. The small nonprofit from Tennessee was ready to go. So thank you all so much for being here. I want to remind everybody to please sign up for NAMI Tennessee's email list, because you find out about events like this. You find out about legislative advocacy. You find out about our walk. You find out about our conventions. You find out about all of the cool things that NAMI is doing in your state of Tennessee. And it's real easy to sign up. It's just you go right there, NAMITN.org, and it's absolutely free. All right, enough about that. You know what to do. I don't have one guest this week. No, one guest. That's so 2019. No. I have two guests. Thank you both for being here. Who would like to introduce themselves first?
I can go first. Thank you for having us, Gabe. And thank you, Mark Zuckerberg, for not turning off the light this Monday afternoon. We appreciate that. My name is Danny George. I'm an associate professor at Penn State College of Medicine. I'm a medical anthropologist by training, and I have worked with my colleague Peter Whitehouse for just about 2 decades now. Both of us are interested in Alzheimer's and dementia, and we look forward to sharing the next hour with everybody and taking your questions. Really excited to do this.
Thank you so much, Gabe, for having both of us. I'm looking forward to a lot of interesting questions and conversation. My name is Peter Whitehouse. I am a geriatric neurologist, although I have training in psychiatry, and I'm a professor at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and also at the University of Toronto in Canada. My interests overlap with Danny. I have been a clinician and worked with elders with cognitive challenges, and have enjoyed this multi-decade collaboration with my young colleague around thinking deeply about Alzheimer's, dementia, what it means to individuals and what it means to society. So looking forward to it.
Well, thank you both for being here. Oh, whoop, I'm doing the head in the sky again. Thank you both for being here. Generally speaking, our first question is always defining our terms. Everybody has heard of Alzheimer's, but I tell you, I bet if I did a poll, we'd end up with so many different definitions. So I'd just like to start right at the beginning. Can one of you define Alzheimer's for us?
Alzheimer's is a term that was invented by Emil Kraepelin, that very famous psychiatrist, in 1910 in an edition of his textbook. And it started as a peculiar, rare case in a younger woman. So the point I'm making by going back in history is saying that the concept, the definition of Alzheimer's has changed, and it's still changing. In our first book, The Myth of Alzheimer's, Danny and I said, and now practically everybody agrees with us, that Alzheimer's is not a singular condition. It's not one thing that can be cured. Some people call it a syndrome. We refer to conditions. And it overlaps with brain aging. And the greatest challenge today, which is a challenge for psychiatry in general, is how do you balance a focus on the clinical features and the obsession with biomarkers that unfortunately affects our field rather negatively.
And if I can just add to that too, to the spirit of your question, Gabe, people will differentiate dementia from Alzheimer's, but the way to think about dementia is the large umbrella category, which encompasses multiple forms of dementia, of which Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause. However, under that umbrella, you have vascular dementias and frontal lobe dementias and Lewy bodies and Parkinson's dementias. And so one theme that we'll strike today, which you'll hear from us probably numerous times, is the syndromal mixed nature of these dementias. There's a lot of overlaps between them, and that really problematizes the idea, as Peter said, that we can cure individual dementias using single drug-targeted approaches.
This leads me right into my next question. I'm a stickler for spelling, even though I misspell things all the time. And trying to figure out how to spell Alzheimer's was a little bit tricky because sometimes it doesn't have the apostrophe S, sometimes it does have the apostrophe S. In the questions you provided, it always had the apostrophe S. So why do you favor speaking of Alzheimer's diseases in the plural? Is it because of the thing that you just said, or is it more? Uh, that was very confusing to me, and that's just a grammar question. We haven't even talked about the illness yet.
So Danny's the English major. I'll defer to grammar, but just to continue what we were saying, yeah, absolutely, it's critical to think of this as something that's heterogeneous. There are multiple genes involved. There are multiple brain systems involved. There are multiple pathological features. And there are multiple ways that these processes can affect people clinically. So the idea of plurality, the idea of syndromes, as we both said, is absolutely key to thinking about how to address this going forward.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I can
Yes,
just
please.
add to that too. Yeah, so Alzheimer's is what they call an eponym in medicine, which is when a disease is named after somebody. Like Parkinson's is named after a doctor named Parkinson. And Peter already alluded to Emil Kraepelin, who was kind of the preeminent psychiatrist in Europe at the time Alois Alzheimer was practicing in his clinic. And just to say a word about Alzheimer, he was actually not really well known for Alzheimer's disease in his lifetime. He was more renowned for his use of therapeutic baths for people with age-related memory impairments. So I think he would be shocked today to know that his last name was associated with this sort of globally dreaded disease, which is still an eponym that's linked to his family name.
Very interesting. Thank you both so very much. So the next question that I have is, it seems like that dementia rates in the US and other Western countries, for that matter, have fallen in the past decade. Is this true? And if it is true, why is that the case? Is it just, are you two doing an extra good job?
Well, Peter, at least. No, it's a fascinating finding, and it's a paradox, right? Because we have not come up with a drug that modifies the disease or reverses Alzheimer's. Biotechnology has not uncovered a cure, despite billions of dollars poured into that endeavor. But what does seem to be working? So dementia rates are falling not just in the U.S. but in 5 other Western European countries. And when you start digging into this data, which is the sort of reason to add for this book, it's the reason we got into this topic, to try to understand this. You see that it's a story about public health and public policy, specifically linked to changes in the mid-20th century. So people will know the Great Depression and the World Wars and the trauma that created at the societal level. And in response to that, the US and other Western countries made major investments in the population. So we had the GI Bill in the United States, which gave access to tens of millions more people to higher education, which we know is a protective factor. We had in the United States, where we had Medicare and Medicaid in the 60s, all of the other countries established national healthcare systems that helped provide frontline care for managing things like vascular risk factors like hypertension and diabetes and high cholesterol, things that we know are kind of part of the risk for brain aging and dementia. We had smoking cessation campaigns that were enormously successful. In the United States, in the 60s, we had 42% of the country smoking. And in 2019, it was down to 14%. So that's a result of public health campaigns targeting smoking cessation. And then the last thing I'll mention is we were able to de-lead gasoline. Now, Peter and I are both I'm from Cleveland originally. Peter works and practices in Cleveland. Our river caught on fire in the late 60s, and that led to the EPA's creation. And so under the Clean Air Act, the EPA was able to gradually de-lead gasoline. And the blood lead levels in American citizens dropped 80% from the 1970s to the 1990s. So you're talking there about, at the large scale level, large investments in population health and population well-being that seem to now be manifesting downstream as benefits to the brain health of people who are now in their graying years. And that's kind of exciting.
It's very exciting. Peter, do you have anything to add to that? Did he cover it all?
Well, Danny covers it all twice. It's great. Only to say, let's think about the future, because all of these things we did then, we stopped doing in many ways. And so we're looking at a huge challenge ahead where we may reverse some of these exciting findings. And we're also living in a time of climate crisis where there are all kinds of other factors that are going to affect our brain health as we go forward, unless we make major policy changes.
Thank you both so much. Now, of course, you're here because you wrote a book. I tell us about your book and your research. That's my hosting. Tell us about your book and your research. Who wants to? Can one of you hold it up?
Well, he's the first author.
That's only fair. That's all. Well, he goes and gets
you
book.
Talk. I'll go get the book.
Okay.
There you go. And I've got a couple of them on the shelf just right behind me, which it feels good to hold a book in your hands after it's such a labor of love. But it's called American Dementia, and yeah, it grew out of, as I said, this research finding of falling dementia rates. But interestingly, in November of 2016, which everybody will remember, it was a kind of chaotic month in this country's history. We had a major election that month, but in that month, we also had this study come out in the Alzheimer's world where a drug called solanezumab, which is an anti-amyloid drug, which we can get into the drug story soon. But that drug failed in its phase 3 trial, which was a major disappointment. But literally a week later, there was a lead story on the front page of the New York Times about a study published in the Journal of American Medical Association by our colleague Ken Langa at Michigan, documenting for the first time these falling rates of dementia in the United States. And so from that paradox, drugs fail again, and yet dementia rates are falling in the United States. That sort of is what spawned this book. And neither Peter or I are political scientists, but as we thought about what was happening here, as you've heard us talk about already a little bit, we're realizing that what's happening is not on the biological molecular level here. This is a story about public health. So you have to zoom out and think about changes, investments at the population level that, take decades to precipitate benefits for people's brains. But that's a really fascinating and undertold story. And so that's what we tried to do in this book. And hopefully Peter was able to retrieve a copy.
Yep, I was showing it as you were talking. Here it is. It's a real book.
There it is.
There it is.
Got a cover and everything.
Yep.
Very
Hopkins Press. Let's put a plug in for our good friends at Johns Hopkins Press. Just to elaborate on that, so I started off being a drug lord. That's what I used to refer to physicians who think drugs are the answer. I don't think I was ever complete. I was a small figure, I was a large figure with a small d and a small l, because I helped develop the first generation of drugs and actually was on the FDA panel that led to their approval. But under the influence of wise people like Danny, I kind of came to realize that this was not the way we were going to solve these problems. And just to say one more thing about our research, Danny and I started doing research together. One of those projects was in the intergenerational public schools that my wife and I started. Danny got his Ph.D. in anthropology, studying the benefits of mentoring young kids on elders, particularly those with dementia, in our school. Some of them were my patients. So I'd love to focus on learning. The brain is a learning organization. We have to learn our way out of this problem. In fact, we have to wise up a bit, because some of the things we're told about dementia and Alzheimer's disease just aren't right anymore. Like it's one thing, or like it's constantly going up and there's no hope from public health. We've got to change the story.
Thank you so much. Now, I understand that part of what your book is covering is this controversial drug that was approved over a drug that wasn't approved, and I'm not going to give it any reasonable question except to say that the drug that was approved works different, and there was controversy around it. Where did the two of you land on the controversy? Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Did the FDA get it right? What's the story, and what are your thoughts on it?
So we could both jump in because we're both passionate about this. But as the person who's been involved in drug development, let me just start and say this was, we agree with our friend Aaron Kesselheim at Harvard. This was probably the worst decision that the FDA ever made. And there are many reasons for that. And The main one is that they used a mechanism called accelerated approval that was too strongly influenced by the company that makes Aduhelm or aducanumab, Biogen, and too strongly influenced by the National Alzheimer's Association, so that the drug was approved without clearly demonstrating clinical benefit to patients, which may sound a little strange, but that's true. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because the biomarker, the amyloid imaging that they used to justify the approval, has not been validated to be connected to clinical outcomes. So yes, it's a terrible story, and we're actively working to try to get the FDA to reverse that, at least learn deeply why that went wrong. And we're not the only ones. The Inspector General is looking at it. Wow. The U.S. Congress is looking at it. There are payers who refuse to pay for it. There are academics who refuse to administer it. This is not the success that the National Alzheimer's Association and Biogen wants us to think it is.
Yeah, and I can build on that too. Peter said it really well, but one thing people will maybe have heard about is the complications from this drug. So in the high dosage group in the clinical trials, there were 40% of people had brain bleeds or brain swelling, edema. So there's significant concerns, and that also means that it's not just a matter of administering this drug. There are also costs associated with doing PET scans and clinical care for people who receive the drug to monitor for these abnormalities. And then I also want to draw people's attention to, because this is such a great encapsulation of how markets and industry and corporate interests have kind of warped our science and our processes in science. So Biogen had two internal projects, one being Project Onyx, which was all about how to sort of manipulate the FDA to get approval. And that's, as Peter said, being investigated right now. Their other internal project was called Project Javelin. And this was one, as an anthropologist, it's quite fascinating. They unfolded as soon as they got approval, they unfolded a website. We won't say the name of it, but basically what they did was have a 6-question cognitive screening quiz for potential consumers. And no matter how you answer that quiz, it sort of says, well, you need to get your memory screened, and it leads you to geolocate your search and connect you with one of their infusion sites locally. So this is a deeply manipulative process for a drug that, as Peter said, has not shown adequate clinical efficacy and has actually shown some very concerning safety risk for people. So I think skepticism, scrutiny is warranted, and Peter and I are certainly going to stay laser focused on it.
Thank you both so much. I want to ask, I understand that your book title has a double entendre. Can you explain?
So I'm the one who speaks French. Yeah, it has two meanings. We added the American dementia part close to the end because brain health in an unhealthy society is the message that Danny's been elaborating so clearly about the importance of social and economic factors that affect brain health. American dementia means that we have a cultural dementia. My friends in England say we're demented too, and I say, well, you caught it from America in part. It is this American fascination with quick fixes. We forget that's a feature of clinical dementia. We can't plan. That's a feature of clinical dementia. We can't take care of our activities of daily living, and we distort our culture by coming up with these ideas that money can buy anything and we can buy a quick fix out of Alzheimer's. It goes back to that original question. It's not one thing. It's not going to be cured, and it is something that we need to address in a more public health way. So that's how it's a cultural dementia that mimics the clinical features of dementia, as I tried to outline.
Yeah, and if I can just say too, to go back to the earlier point about the changes that we saw in response to the crisis of the Great Depression and the World Wars, essentially what was implemented in the US and in other countries was what could be called social democracy. This was, trying to work within the parameters of capitalism to limit capital mobility, provide safety nets for people, kind of a strong welfare state. And the state's role was essentially to provide for citizens again. And that was sort of what defined the mid 20th century. And we saw the robust growth of a middle class and extending life expectancy for people, and many other gains that, as we've said, are linked to brain health. But something happened, another crisis cropped up in the 70s, and that was stagflation and the oil shocks. And that led to another sort of radical reorganization of society around what Peter and I and many others call neoliberalism or hypercapitalism. This was the idea of unleashing markets in our lives, right? Having capital mobility around the globe, globalization, shipping tens of millions of jobs abroad, and deregulating industries, decreasing funding for social programs and cutting taxes on the wealthy, and then attacking unions. All of those were sort of hallmarks of this era of neoliberalism, which was in its own way a sort of derangement or dementia that has unleashed particular effects on the culture. So doing this as a society has created great wealth, right? We're the wealthiest country ever, but we're also the most unequal country ever, because we've cut those safety nets and failed to regulate capital and all of those things. And so what has followed downstream from that is falling life expectancy. We lost a whole year and a half of life expectancy last year, but before that, 4 of the 5 last years had shown falling life expectancy. We've had rising rates of depression and anxiety, as your audience will be well acquainted with. One thing I study at Penn State is deaths of despair. We're losing 160,000 Americans every year to suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholism, from largely connected to the material decline in people's lives that follow from the changes wrought by the 1970s and neoliberalism. We have another lead crisis on our hands. Flint, Michigan has sort of stolen the headlines, but in any country, in Tennessee, in Cleveland, wherever around the country, there is lead in our drinking water, and no amount of lead is safe for the brain. But this is a crisis that's been caused because we've deregulated, we've cut our regulatory oversight, our environmental regulation. We've shipped, like in Flint, just alone in Flint had 80,000 jobs in the mid 20th century. And now it's less than 8,000 jobs there because all the jobs got shipped to Mexico, in the manufacturing sector. So there are grave consequences for the way that we have reorganized society over the last several decades. And I think it's fair to call that a dementia or a derangement or, something that implies that there's a sort of psychosis to the way that we have structured things.
If you're interested, Gabe, I think I've worked with NAMI in the past, and I think their voice is very important. And that issue of Alzheimer's and its relationship to to behavioral challenges or mental challenges is really key. Alzheimer and Kreplin were psychiatrists at a time when you really didn't differentiate between a psychiatrist and a neurologist. But today, psychiatrists think that neurology has this advantage that we have, biomarkers. We have things in the brain that can make us certain that this is not a normal state. In actual fact, that's really messy and murky because the relationships between these pathological features and the clinical features, as I said before, are unclear. So not only because of their own personal concerns, perhaps your audience because they're getting older, but if they're interested in advocacy for people that have cognitive and mental challenges, Alzheimer's is a really important place to pay attention because it has lessons for the broader issues in psychiatry, as Danny was just suggesting as well.
Danny, one of the things that you talked about, which leads me into my next question, was all of the changes that have happened since the 70s. Protective factors, as you say. We stopped protecting these things. We stopped caring about these things. We deregulated this, which allowed this to happen. I think about mental illness, and I know one of the worst places to be if you have a mental illness is in poverty. Being in poverty is not a great place to be. Hard stop, but obviously, if you're sick. And I'm curious, what are the ways in which poverty impacts Alzheimer's, brain health, dementia? I mean, I know it's all part and parcel, but aside from it's not good, what are the ways that it impacts it? And then the question that I'll ask afterwards is, what are some protective factors? So we'll just separate that out into two.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and we have a whole chapter in the book, which we frame through the Fight for 15, which is the sort of advocacy organization that is pushing for fast food workers to earn a living wage. And when you look at the data on what's protective for Alzheimer's, the inverse of that, what is risky for brain aging, nutrition. We know that a Mediterranean and low sodium diet are protective for brain health. But if you're poor, if you're a member of the working class in this country, it's exceedingly hard and expensive to achieve that kind of diet consistently. Yeah. If you're working multiple jobs, if you're doing gig economy work, trying to piece together a living, there's not only excess stress and anxiety in your life, but you don't have time to exercise, and you may live in a neighborhood that's not conducive to safely exercising. You're also, if you're poor in this country, exposed to environmental toxins like lead in disproportionate ways to people who are wealthier. And that's not just lead. I mean, air pollution, we're increasingly seeing is a risk factor. The particulates from air pollution can cross the blood-brain barrier. Research is showing that causes oxidative stress and neuroinflammation. So people should keep an eye on that story. I live in central Pennsylvania now, where College of Medicine is. And if you're poor here, you're more inclined to live near fracking sites or wastewater sites. So in a whole host of ways, poverty kind of disproportionately affects the social determinants of dementia in ways that we find really regrettable.
Thank you so much. Peter, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I'll move it into the protective question because
Please.
As a clinician, I obviously gave advice to my patients about what they could do to promote their own individual health. And Danny's alluded to some of those things. Clearly diet, exercise, keeping your mind active, particularly on purposeful activities like volunteering in the intergenerational school, to put a plug in there again. But I think the other part about neoliberalism, a word that Danny's taught me to use, and I think it's an important one for people to think deeply about. It's not just the hypercapitalism where, the market will solve all problems. It's the individualism. So you could advise individual patients to do all these good activities. But as Danny said, if they live in a neighborhood that's not safe, if they don't have places in nature to visit, if they don't have access to clean water. So this is an issue not of individual brain health as much as it is a matter of collective will to use a democracy to be more equitable, because as you all both said, income and equity, that the poverty, it's not just poverty, it's the income and equity between the very wealthy and the very poor that is consistently associated with countries that have poor health.
Thank you both so much. Now, along these same lines, but really something that is impacting everybody, regardless of socioeconomic status, is the billion-dollar marketplace of memory industry, because it's warped all of our thinking. I don't want to mention any of these sites, but I think about all these sites where it's just like, send us $1,000 a month and we'll send you these magical pills and rubs, and nothing bad will ever happen to you ever again. And a customized vitamin based on, you fill out like a 12 question survey, and this little packet of pills shows up, and that's going to keep you alive forever. But yeah, I suppose that quick fix would make me think, hey, I've done it. I take that little packet of pills, or I apply that cream or whatever. Now dementia, Alzheimer's, none of these things are a problem for me. How has this billion-dollar industry warped society's thinking about preventing Alzheimer's and dementia?
Yeah, like aducanumab, this industry is like a perfect encapsulation of how neoliberalism has warped our understanding of brain health. And led us down the wrong path, Peter and I would argue. But yes, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry which has largely targeted baby boomers over the last decade, preying on people's fear of memory loss, fear of cognitive decline. But increasingly, we're seeing those ads targeting people my age and Gabe's age, millennials and even Zoomers now, people who exist in these very competitive knowledge-based economies that we have today. So everybody trying to get an edge with a supplement or a brain fitness app or game or a nutraceutical. But yeah, it reflects a particular ideology of neoliberalism, which is that through enlightened self-consumption, we can save ourselves, right? There's almost something religious about it. But the FTC and other regulatory bodies have really started cracking down on some of the marketing language, as Gabe, you pointed out, that overpromises what these products can do. Preventing dementia, enhancing your cognition. All of these things are good market copy from Madison Avenue, but they are not scientifically, empirically validated. And so, the message that Peter and I want to send, and this goes sort of back to your last question, which, what's protective for brain aging. There's this concept called cognitive reserve, which is another exciting, optimistic finding over the last few decades, which is this idea that if you put your brain in if you put yourself in novel learning situations over the course of your life, if you volunteer, if you travel, if you read, if you keep your mind stimulated over the course of your life, if you engage in relationships with other people that keeps you cognitively nimble, if you do what Gabe is doing right now, which is run the show and interview his guests, I mean, all of these things are able to some ways create resilience in the brain that makes us, resilient to the neuropathologies of old age, the plaques and tangles, the vascular risk factors that we see in aging brains. If you stimulate your brain, there is some evidence that can protect you. And so that's why something like the intergenerational school is so powerful for Peter and I, because it is something that is not a product on a market that an alienated consumer buys. It is an embedded, shared common space in a community where people form the protective bonds and relationships that we know are protective for people who may be aging, but also cognitively stimulating and building of that cognitive reserve. So we'd rather we would rather have people be critical of the marketplace of memory and kind of see different horizons for brain health. Peter, I'm sure you have something to add to that.
Well, I think you said it well. Look at people looking at Zoom. Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Facebook, Instagram, the digital technologies are a mixed blessing. So I do a lot of intergenerational work online, some with the intergenerational school. So that's a good thing. I guess the use of brain fitness, brain games, virtual reality, there is some benefit to some of those. But as I said to all my patients, look at how much you're spending. Look at how much money you're spending, because basically, as Danny said, there's lots of ways of keeping your brain active that includes a greater sense of joy, purpose, and meaningfulness. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to spend a lot of money. And I'm perfectly willing to say also that evidence suggests if you do that in nature, that is a particularly important aspect of learning and engagement, not just with fellow human beings, but other living creatures. So, and that's so important in a time of climate crisis.
I could not agree more. I am not a person who likes to go outside. I want to self-disclose that so nobody who's watching who knows me is like, he was lying on that show. However, that said, I do feel better after exercise. I can't deny it. And exercise that's outside, the breeze blowing through, there are times that I do go outside. If I go to a concert, concerts, you have to park a half a mile away. It's afterwards, you've got the energy from being at the concert. You're walking through the night air. You're experiencing things that you don't normally experience. During the day, the sun, even though the sun is a redhead's mortal enemy, I cannot deny that there is something about it. And finally, I saw the California redwood trees. These things are enormous. And there's just something about a 1,000-year-old tree that makes you question everything. So, from the simple went for a walk, just at night or during the day, all the way to, the redwood forest. I, who is not prone to like these sort of things, can tell people that there is, in fact, something there. So I do recommend it. I want to switch gears ever so slightly because I want to get to it because it fascinated me when I saw this come up, but there was something called the Nun Study, and I don't want to give anything away, so just can you explain what the Nun Study was and what we learned from it?
Yeah, Peter always gives me the Nun Study question, which I love. This is a really cool study. It's so in the 1990s, this order of several hundred nuns dedicated their brains to science effectively, and let scientists look at their brains after they had passed on. And what the researchers found is this really important finding, which connects to cognitive reserve, what I just mentioned, that many of the nuns had changes in their brains that would be consistent with Alzheimer's type pathology, plaques and tangles, other inflammation, vascular changes, small strokes, and yet they didn't have dementia. In other words, the pathology is not destiny. And that study, the Nun Study, has been replicated in multiple countries, over the last several decades. And it's this it feeds this encouraging, optimistic story, which is about 40% of people who are normally aged have Alzheimer's related pathology. Many of the people listening to this will have some pathology in their brains, but that doesn't mean that you're going to get Alzheimer's. And in fact, if you take brain health seriously hopefully in the ways that the broader ways Peter and I are suggesting, you can have cognitive reserve. You can be resilient longer and in your life and withstand some age-related changes to the brain. So the Nun Study is really at the core of sort of a more hopeful way of thinking about brain aging.
Thank you so much. It's how long did I know there was this vast, but how long did the study go on for? Because this wasn't a short, they didn't just interview a whole bunch of nuns and come up with a conclusion. The study lasted a while.
Yeah, it was over the course of a decade, really. And
right.
one other interesting finding that I'll point out is that the researchers looked at the diaries of the nuns, which is a really kind of interesting approach. And what they found is that the nuns who had the highest cognitive reserve, in other words, didn't have dementia, even though having age-related changes in their brains, had what the researchers called a higher idea density in their diaries. In other words, they had minds that had learned, that had assimilated information, that were reflective, that were purposeful, and that was all reflected in the diary entries and the sort of complexity, written lexical complexity in those diaries. So again, just another endorsement of keeping your mind active in ways that are purposeful and community engaged.
And also just to add positive, because in those diaries, the nuns that found positive things in life, found something to where they used language with words that communicated that, also did better. There's a whole movement called positive aging, which I don't think we have to have a balance. There are some challenges with aging as well. But the idea that you look at life's gifts and that you look at those gifts in community is really key. The mission statement of our intergenerational schools, including lifelong learning, but also spirited citizenship. So the idea that the nuns gave positively to their community is something we should all recognize as we really try to engage more in the democratic process to challenge some of these income inequities and policies that are so bad for our brains.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. This is sort of my own personal question. I'm just curious about it. My grandfather he's 90 years old. He still mows his own lawn. I know this because I don't mow my lawn. So he constantly tells me I'm 90 years old and I mow my own lawn. So it's important to point that out there. But he says that one of the reasons that he is so doing so well at 90, both in terms of physical health and his own mental health, is because he reads a book a week and because he exercises daily, doing things like still mowing his own lawn and things like that. Now, focusing purely in on he reads a book a week, he believes very strongly that one of the things that wards off age-related, dementia, Alzheimer's, and things like that is the fact that he still does things that involve his brain, like read the book, like do a crossword puzzle, like do a puzzle, anything like that. Is there truth in this? Is there a little bit of truth, a lot of truth? How correct or incorrect is Gabe's grandfather?
So I'm going to jump in because I have a new word for a book. The first thing I would say is maybe you should suggest your grandfather mow your lawn because then he'd have double his lawn mowing. But no, when I go to a library or a bookstore, I will sometimes say, isn't it wonderful to be surrounded by all these multi-neurotransmitter lexical protective what do I say, Daddy? Neuroprotective devices, multi-neurotransmitter neuroprotective devices, something we used to call books. Books stimulate your brain in amazing ways. And if I had a PET scan of people reading books, it would show all kinds of things lighting up, including imagination, for example. So yeah, I'm a bibliotherapist. I actually did a study where I gave books out as a part of a study to try to determine whether reading books might actually prevent brain health. It was a rather complicated story, which I won't elaborate, but I'm absolutely with your grandfather. And don't tell him I told him that you should mow your lawn because it's good for you to mow your lawn. I will send you a big hat so you don't get the sunshine that you don't like, Gabe.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for answering that question. Another question that I want to ask is, you talk about a dementia-friendly community, and it's a weird thing to say. We want to have a dementia-friendly community, but I know that it's important. What is a dementia-friendly community, and what makes for a dementia-friendly community?
Yeah, so one thing that we metaphorically associate with Alzheimer's is people often talk about it causes a loss of self, right? It's a death that leaves the person behind, etc. But what's even more critical than that is that dementia can create a loss of place for people. It can create a social death. Just that label alone is so stigmatizing that it can remove people from those protective bonds that we were talking about earlier at places like the intergenerational school. So dementia-friendly communities are predicated on this idea that we need to destigmatize this condition. So, for instance, in the intergenerational school, people from Peter's clinic who had Alzheimer's disease diagnoses in the school were considered mentors. And that subtle change positions people differently in the culture, right? In the research that I did at an assisted living home, people from the locked dementia care unit would sort of be laying in bed. And then we would go and say, you guys can volunteer with kids today. We'd love to have you to help teach our kids. And we'd get them on a bus and we'd go to the school and they would be mentors. And it would just bring a different vibrancy out of them because they were embedded in community again, and they weren't just being treated as patients with, and having all their needs administered to. People were able to reprise roles as teachers or social workers and whatnot. So when we talk about dementia-friendly communities, it's really asking that central question: how do we integrate people who have memory challenges? How do businesses modify themselves? How does transportation modify itself to be more friendly to people? Can we train children to be able to note and support people with memory loss? What would it mean to, instead of warehousing people in assisted living homes, what would it mean to have communities that support people the way we have for most of human history until the last 100 years, basically? And so there's a dementia-friendly communities movement right now afoot. People can Google that. There's also an age-friendly communities movement that the UN is the driving force behind. But all of these are sort of asking the question in all of these kind of aging Western countries: are there cultural adaptations and modifications we can make to better include people who have dementia and not just kind of consign them to a social death?
I would elaborate, though, and I find the term a little weird too, Gabe, maybe for a different reason. We don't need a schizophrenia-friendly community or an autism-friendly community. As Danny said, I think all these efforts should be embedded in a friendly community movement. That's to say, an inclusive community that celebrates neurodiversity without, being overly romantic about some of the challenges people face with mental illness. So I constantly say, age friendly. Do you mean what age do you have to be friendly to? I mean, so they say communities for all ages. Well, if it's communities for all ages and all cognitive abilities, it's just friendly communities. which is at the heart of social democracies, where you do put more energy into helping your neighbor and making your own community friendly as part of a community of communities.
Oh, thank you both so much. Now, along these same lines, you have an I'm gonna just butcher this, ecopsychosocial model of health, and your approach to the treatment of brain aging. What are the key features? First, explain what that is, and then the key features of that, because it was very interesting to me when I first came across it. So I'm glad we have the experts here, because I would just butcher an explanation.
Well, I'm going to jump in before Danny does, because I invented that word, ecopsychosocial. But your readers who are familiar with George Engel will know that biopsychosocial has been a part of psychiatry for a long time. And that is to say that health needs to be looked at lots of different levels: the biology, the psychological factors, and the social. But I essentially Danny Glenn helped develop it, so it made sense, said the doctors got the biology wrong. It's not just molecular biology. It's not just pharmacology. That biology needs to be embedded in ecology, in an ecosystem focus. So this says that the biology, and in fact, we could go into elaborations of how genetics have changed, but the old models of genetics are just completely thrown aside by concepts like epigenetics, which says, yes, it's the environments that genes find themselves in. So putting eco instead of bio gets us to think about biology in a richer and deeper way, and again brings us back to the climate, environment, and all the factors we're talking about are so important for brain health.
And Danny, I know that you have stuff to add.
Yeah, I think, we have a chapter on climate change in the book, and we lead it with a picture that people may have seen, because it's a very powerful image. It was during the storms and hurricane in Texas in 2017, and there were these assisted living home residents in near Houston who were basically submerged in water, like shoulder deep in water. And it took a long time for the National Guard to be able to get to them and save them. But in the meantime, they were just kind of sitting submerged in this brackish water. And, that's just to say that climate change is something that's going to disproportionately affect the vulnerable, which is not just, people who are poor, working class, but the elderly as well. Temperature changes are going to disproportionately create higher risk for mortality from heat stroke and such things. But then you also think through this ecopsychosocial model about something like, wars that are created from competition over resources like water, which is going to be exacerbated by climate change. And the war in Syria, for instance, was exacerbated by a massive drought that happened. Wars create traumatic brain injuries. Those elevate risk for dementia. So we can't just think, especially at the level of individual brains. We need to zoom out, think about brains that are part of families, communities, and nations and ecosystems. And so that's basically what the ecopsychosocial model aims us towards.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I want to segue into myths. I know that there's a lot of myths about Alzheimer's, and it's led us astray in our search for not only effective treatment, but of also coming up with a cure. If we're looking in the wrong direction because we believe, a YouTube video, we're probably not going to get effective treatment. But I'm interested that you wrote "and a cure," because I would like to think that doctors, researchers aren't impacted by the myths. But from my perspective, I was like, really, the myths are leading us astray from a cure. So that's a double question. How are the myths impacting people's ability to get treatment? And then how are the myths impacting us finding a cure?
Boy, that's a tough, multifaceted question. So let me answer the simple parts, and Danny can answer the complicated parts. The book, The Myth of Alzheimer's, basically said there's a powerful, dominant narrative, a powerful story going on, which is if you just invest enough money in research, we will find a cure for the single disease we call Alzheimer's, which is unrelated to aging. And in fact, if you Google the myth of Alzheimer's, you'll find competing myths, because some people say Alzheimer's is not related to aging, and that the arguments continue. So we've got battling myths here. The reason it's so important with regards to where we're headed is this word cure. The people in the Alzheimer's movement say care today, cure tomorrow, if we just give enough money, as if somehow we're not going to have to care for older people, or that we're somehow going to eradicate every lost memory. People don't even ask the question, what is a cure look like? If I'm 85 and I'm cured of my Alzheimer's, what's my memory going to look like when I was 65, 35, or 5? I mean, people use the word cure as if it's magical, and that's part of mythology. So we're challenging the dominant magic and saying there's other magic, there's other positive things we can do, and that's the magic that has allowed human beings to thrive over the hundreds of thousands of years we've been a species. But we're forgetting some of those lessons. It's time to go back to some of those myths, which really are at the center of being a human being.
Yeah, if I can pick up on that, I think that the proposition that if we throw enough money at a problem, we'll reach a cure eventually is effectively a form of superstition in itself, as Peter is saying. And so let's go back to our understanding, empirical understanding of what Alzheimer's disease is. Okay, it's not one thing, even though we've focused in on amyloid, beta amyloid, which is a constituent part of the plaques that are associated with the tangles that have basically been declared toxic. And all of our drug efforts have been aimed at removing or preempting amyloid in the brain. We have assigned value that is toxic. All of the drugs targeting amyloid have failed, including aducanumab, Peter and I would argue. And why is that happening? Well, remember this syndromal nature. When we talk about dementias, most dementias are mixed. In other words, you don't just have plaques and tangles with Alzheimer's. People with Alzheimer's often have vascular changes in their brain. They often have other abnormal proteins like Lewy bodies or white matter disease. And so targeting one aspect of that diffuse syndrome, amyloid, and trying to remove it is sort of the same notion, from past decades where, if we bomb Al-Qaeda, we'll eliminate terrorism. Obviously what we're dealing with is a much larger constellation of problems, and it may be resistant to instrumental solutions. And, what Peter and I want to do in this book, and when we're lucky to have conversations with folks like yourself and your audience, Gabe, is just try to tell the truth about what Alzheimer's is and what the challenges are in terms of drug development, and why, despite billions of dollars of investment, drugs have 100% fail rate. I mean, there's a reason for that, right? And I think there's so much co-optation in the Alzheimer's field, and there's so many vested interests in there being a cure. And people have genuine hope that we will have a cure, but I think we do have to pull back and try to define what we're talking about and level with people about the realism of that. And, as Peter said, try to direct hope at more genuine avenues. And that's why the bigger, broader public health picture is necessary in our view.
Very cool. Thank you both so much for being here. I have one final question. We have about 3 minutes left, but I feel that it's an important one. It culminates everything that we've been talking about. How will a successful response to Alzheimer's equip Americans to tackle other major social health or major societal challenges? Because everything that you've talked about, this impacts this, this is over here. It was almost like a puzzle. So it really sounds like one's going to fix, not fix, is probably not the right word, but it's all interconnected. Tie it up in a nice bow for us.
So the idea that we use is that Alzheimer's is a lever for social change. If you understand the forces at work that created this false myth that is leading us down this wrong path, then you will, pardon me for that you will learn lessons about how the market distorts thinking, about how scientism, the faith in technology and science, unbridled by skepticism, can cause us to go down the wrong path. So the lessons from this fear-provoking concept and the positive lessons about looking at health in a different way can affect our health, not only of our brains, but our bodies, our communities, our species, I would argue.
Thank you. And Danny, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll try to tie the bow a little tighter. Peter did a great job, of course. But so the subtitle of our book is Brain Health in an Unhealthy Society. But what would a healthy society look like based on what we know about what's preventative and protective for our brains? Well, we would argue that universal health care is something that could help control the vascular risk factors, the hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol, et cetera, from millions more Americans. Obviously, we have 80 million underinsured in this country, which is not great. Access to mental health care, obviously, is an issue that is pertinent to this problem as well. People better managing anxiety, stress, depression in their lives. In terms of cognitive reserve, what if we provided, just like we did with the GI Bill and Pell Grants and state subsidized universities in the 20th century, what if we made higher education tuition free, as has been talked about? What if we provided vocational training for people? Those things could have inputs for cognitive reserve for our generation. We talked about poverty earlier. What if we had a jobs guarantee for people and a living wage, a true living wage that would reduce precarity in people's lives and reduce stress and anxiety many times over? Addressing the lead crisis and focusing on environmental toxins, as we've talked about, lead, air pollution, and those sorts of things. And then providing national long-term care insurance, as countries like Japan do, where everybody pays into a system, and basically you get institutional or in-home care guaranteed to you as a right, as a citizen. And then the last thing that I'll mention, which sort of goes to this notion of what we've seen as effective in assisted living environments. Peter and I would love to see funding for the arts in dementia care, because some of the most powerful interventions, quote unquote, are storytelling and music and gardening. To your earlier point, Gabe, about just being in green spaces and how beneficial that is. Volunteering, having children come into assisted living homes. So instead of pouring all of our money into drug development, what if we thought about what's actually effective for people in assisted living care in terms of their quality of life and cognitive resilience? So those would be aspects of a healthier society that we would love to pursue.
Danny, Peter, thank you so much. Peter, I'm going to make you giant on the screen so you can hold up the book one more time. Give us a quick plug. Tell folks where to find it.
So what if we put Gabe on the radio 5 days a week? Oh, no, the wrong plug. American Dementia, Brain Health in an Unhealthy Society. I hope we've stimulated you to be interested in pursuing these concepts and even possibly buy the book. Available on Amazon, your local bookstore, in Kindle. And thank you for being with us today. And thank you so much, Gabe.
You are very welcome. I do like the first plug, everyone. 5 days a week. I think I could handle 5 days a week. I mean, I need like the Howard Stern size salary that goes along with it. But
That's right.
Danny, Peter, thank you both so very much. All right, everybody that's been listening, Oh, sorry. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer that question. I apologize. I hit the wrong button. I feel terrible. But I'm going to tell everybody about the NAMI Tennessee's email list. Please go to namitn.org and sign up now so you don't miss things like this. Obviously, the video lasts forever, and buy the book, right? Thank you both so much for being here. Big wave goodbye to everybody, and we'll see you next Monday. Bye, everyone.